Hello there, and welcome back to today's episode of Black Mirror, where you'll leave equally intrigued and horrified. Okay, we are continuing with our discussion of government interventions in the market. We are just starting part C of this. We are given an initial equilibrium where the market price is 33, and the government's going to come in and impose a price floor of $40. So the government says you may not charge less than $40 for this good. So let's take a look at what's going to happen here. At $40, producers are loving that. They would love for the price to go up. That's good for them. They would like to be supplying, let's say, about 41 units. Consumers, on the other hand, are like, no, thank you. At that price, they would only like to consume 20 units. When that happens, there's actually going to be a excess of supply. So producers want to produce 41 units. Consumers only want to consume 20 of those. So there would be 21 extra units out there that are just going to be wasted because nobody wants them. So let's take a look and see what happens to all the different, to consumer surplus and producer surplus, and see if we are going to get a deadweight loss, the dreaded deadweight loss. Spoiler alert, we are. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video and draw some lines in here. Okay, so let's start with consumer surplus. So the original consumer surplus was the area above the original price but below the demand curve. And then the new consumer surplus is the area of the triangle that's below the demand curve and above the new price. So this little guy right here. So this is bad for consumers. So the change in consumer surplus is this trapezoid that looks familiar. Right here. Well, why'd you erase it, Igor? So, oops, sorry, I drew that too far. So in the new price, only 20 units are exchanged. The consumer surplus is now the small triangle, and we've lost this piece. Why am I erasing? Oh, I'm on eraser, that's why. We've lost this piece of the triangle. So that's been lost. Sad face. Okay, let's look at producer surplus. So the original producer surplus was this area above the supply curve but below the original price. So this is the original producer surplus. Lost my price floor. The new producer surplus is going to be everything above the supply curve but below the price. So the new producer surplus is right here. We're only exchanging 20 units. So this is the new producer surplus. So notice, in contrast to the last example, here, this rectangle right here, this rectangle used to belong to consumers, and now it belongs to producers. So this rectangle right here is surplus that was lost by consumers but then just transferred to producers. So that's not a net loss to the economy as a whole. Again, as we said at the beginning, the price floor is great for producers because they are able to sell their product at a price that's higher than what the market would actually like to pay. But just like we saw on the producer side, we've lost this triangle here. Like this piece that used to be part of producer surplus actually has not been transferred to anybody. So again, just like in the previous example, we have this triangle of lost surplus that's deadweight loss. So part of the surplus, part of the original total surplus was transferred to producers, and then some of it was just lost from deadweight loss. So that's the effect of a price floor. Okay, let's see what Part D is. All right, so here the government limits quantity to 10 units. So here, originally the market equilibrium quantity was right around here. It looks like maybe 33 units, let's say. So the government comes along and says, okay, that's not allowed anymore. We're only going to allow 10 units to be exchanged. So let's take a look and see what happens with that. Okay, so the first thing we want to look at is what price is going to prevail in the market here. So when there's only 10 units, consumers are willing to pay, I think this is 5, 10, 15, 20, so each one is 5. So consumers are willing to pay $45 per unit when there's only 10 units out there. So that's going to be the market price that occurs. So we can go through the surpluses again. The original consumer surplus, again, is the area underneath the demand curve but above the original price. The new producer surplus is the area underneath the demand curve above the new price. So consumers lost this whole trapezoid. Producers are going to pick up a portion of that, but spoiler alert, some of it's going to be deadweight loss. So consumers lost this entire trapezoid. On the producer side, the original producer surplus was everything above the supply curve but below the original market cost. So that's going to be this triangle. And under the quantity restriction, producer surplus is going to be everything above the supply curve but below the new price line. So that's going to be this area. So notice producers are picking up this rectangle of surplus from consumers. All right. However, these two triangles, as usual, were not recovered by anybody. So this is the deadweight loss of that policy, this area combined. So consumers are worse off under this. Their surplus got much smaller. Producers may be better off or worse off, but in total, we know that the economy loses this deadweight loss. Okay. Okay, so let's start talking about taxes. A per unit tax is called an excise tax. The government can impose excise taxes on either buyers or sellers. That just means who the government is going to collect the money from at the end of the year or whatever. As we're going to see, who ends up having to bear the actual cost of the tax, whether it's producers or consumers, may not be the exact same as who the government is collecting money from. In these examples, I'll talk about, the government is putting a tax on producers or on consumers. That just means who the government collects the tax from. So if the tax is imposed on consumers, it shifts the demand curve down by the amount of the tax. If the tax is imposed on producers or sellers, it shifts the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. So we're going to look at two scenarios here and see who bears the cost of taxes and whether or not it makes a difference which side the tax is imposed on. So in our first scenario, we are going to put a $10 per unit tax on consumers. People used to be willing to pay, this looks like $50. Is this intercept up here? Yep. So now every point is going to be shifted down by $10. So let me see what I aim for here. Okay. So that is the new demand curve. Okay, so my dog's shuffling around. Okay, so let's look and see what happens to all the surpluses. Okay, so originally consumer surplus was the area under the demand curve but above the original price. The new so the first thing we need to look at under tax is to realize that unlike all the previous examples we've looked at, we now have a third actor in our scenario here. Used to be we just had producers and consumers. Now, because the government is actually collecting money, there's going to be government surplus as well. So there are three different parties that are making surplus here. And the other thing we need to keep in consideration is that the price that the consumer pays is not going to be equal to the price that the firm accepts, because the government's going to take a chunk out of this. So if I am a buyer and I go to the store and I pay $20 for something, but I have to pay $5 of that in tax, not all that money went towards the actual good that I'm buying. So on the graph, this is where the new equilibrium would be. And so what's happening here is that consumers are paying this price, right? It looks like, let's call it $39. But then producers are only getting this much. This would be $29. Because in this scenario, the tax is $10. So for every unit, the government is getting $10. So when we look at consumer surplus started as the blue triangle that we shaded there. Now it's this triangle right here. So the change in consumer surplus is negative this trapezoid. Okay, so on the producer side, the original producer surplus is the area above the supply curve but below the original price. So this shaded green triangle. The new consumer or producer surplus is the area underneath this, so the area under 29 but above the supply curve, because again, a chunk of what's being paid in the market is being consumed by the government. So then the change in producer surplus is minus this trapezoid. They lost this much. But what about the government? So some of this money wasn't just lost. The government was here. So remember, the government is collecting $10 per unit, and there were 20 units now being exchanged. Oh, sorry, not 20. It's however many units this is. Looks like maybe 22. So the government gets $10 for each of those 22 units. So the government actually collects, I'm trying to shade in this rectangle here, this whole rectangle is worth of stuff, of revenue. So under the tax,